I've been thinking about tourniquets. Specifically, I've been thinking about the headline I came across recently that was claiming that the military was starting to teach their troops how to remove tourniquets. And my first reaction was, starting? Because when I went through the Army's combat medic course in 2008, and while 18 years is more than enough time for memories to blur, and doctrine has obviously changed since then, I distinctly remember being taught that tourniquets had to be reassessed during prolonged evacuation. The rule, as I remember learning it, was that if a tourniquet had been in place for around 2 hours and the casualty was stable and evacuation was still a long way off, you needed to consider transitioning to another method of hemorrhage control. We called that relieving the tourniquet. Today, the preferred term would generally be conversion, but the underlying idea was not new to me. So when I first heard that the military was now teaching people to remove tourniquets, I assumed that somebody had taken an old piece of medical knowledge, stripped away all the context, and built a provocative headline around it. And that's partly what happened, but not entirely. Because the military is not suddenly teaching combat medics that tourniquets can be converted. Combat medics have understood that for decades. But the new part is who else may need to make that decision. And the reason the military is reconsidering who receives that training tells us something much larger about the battlefield that expects American troops to fight on next. I'm going to be reading off of this a lot more than I already usually do because there's a lot of very important information in here, so you guys are going to have to bear with me just a little bit. This was already doctrine. I went back and checked what the Committee on Tactical Combat Casualty Care was saying in 2008. And surprisingly, my memory held up fairly well. The July 2008 COTCCC meeting minutes said that when evacuation was expected to take longer than 2 hours and casualty was not in shock, providers should consider removing, or more accurately, releasing the tourniquet after transitioning to another method of hemorrhage control. The document discussed packing the wound, applying pressure, using a pressure dressing, or using a hemostatic agent before cautiously removing the tourniquet. It also said not to attempt that transition if the casualty was in shock or if evacuation to a medical facility was expected within 2 hours. So the principle was already there, not as some obscure footnote discovered after Ukraine. It was approved TCCC guidance during the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that immediately changed the story. This is not the military has discovered that tourniquets can hurt people. We have understood ischemia for a very long time. This is not 20 years of tourniquet training were wrong. They were not. And it is not medics are finally being taught how to remove tourniquets. They already were. The real question becomes, if medics already knew this, who was not being taught it, and why does the military now believe that they need to know? The rule most people remember. Most people have received basic tourniquet training remember some version of the same rule. Put it on tight, mark the time, do not take it off. That message did not become common because military medicine forgot that prolonged arterial occlusion could damage tissue. It became common because training has to manage the most immediate and consequential error. Imagine a casualty has a partially amputated leg or a major arterial injury. Someone applies a tourniquet and stops the bleeding. Then, 30 minutes later, another person decides the casualty looks uncomfortable, the limb looks pale, or the tourniquet has probably been on long enough. They loosen it, the casualty begins bleeding again. That mistake can kill someone in minutes. So the simple rule places the decision outside the basic responder's authority. You stop the bleeding, someone with more training handles what comes next. That is a very reasonable training model when someone with more training is actually coming. It is also a reasonable model when the casualty is expected to move relatively quickly through an organized evacuation system. During Iraq and Afghanistan, tourniquets were used extensively and saved lives with comparatively little significant morbidity from prolonged limb ischemia. The Joint Trauma System attributes part of that success to evacuation times that were often around 1 to 2 hours or less. The tourniquet was never operating by itself. It existed inside of a chain. A soldier or a Marine would stop the bleeding, a medic reassessed the casualty, an evacuation platform moved them, a surgical team took over, and when that chain functions quickly, the safest lesson for a minimally trained responder is usually to apply the tourniquet correctly and leave more complicated decisions to the next level of care. The simplicity was intentional and it worked. Line troops is too broad. Modern TCCC training is divided into tiers. Tier 1 is all service members. That is the baseline course intended to give ordinary military personnel a small number of life-saving skills. Tier 2 is Combat Lifesaver. These are the non-medical personnel who receive significantly more training and may be expected to provide more substantial care until medical personnel become available. Tier 3 is the Combat Medic or Corpsman. Tier 4 covers advanced combat paramedics and providers. The commonly published course lengths illustrate the difference. All service member training is approximately 7 hours, while the standardized Combat Lifesaver program is about 40 hours. Combat Medic and Corpsman TCCC training is longer and designed for personnel who already have a medical role. So when someone says the military is teaching soldiers to convert tourniquets, that can mean several very different things. A rifleman who completed only baseline all-service member training is not the same as a rifleman selected and trained as the platoon's combat lifesaver. Both are non-medics. Both could reasonably be called line troops, but their expected medical capabilities are not interchangeable, and combat lifesavers are not just now learning this. The April 2026 standardized CLS course plan specifically includes identifying the indications and methods for tourniquet conversion and demonstrating the procedure during tactical field care. That means even the more provocative version, the military is teaching line troops to remove tourniquets, still needs qualification. Some non-medical troops were already receiving this training. The genuinely important expansion is toward the lowest tier, ordinary service members who may have only baseline medical education. What is actually changing? The recent TCCC change attempts to standardize 3 separate ideas: reassessment, repositioning, and conversion. Those words are not synonyms. Reassessment means exposing the wound, checking whether the tourniquet is actually needed, and confirming that it is controlling the bleeding effectively. Repositioning means moving a tourniquet to a more appropriate position on the same limb. For example, a tourniquet placed high over clothing during care under fire may later be replaced by one positioned directly on the skin closer to the wound when the tactical situation allows a proper examination. Conversion means transitioning from the tourniquet to another reliable method of hemorrhage control. And removal means taking off a tourniquet that was determined not to be necessary. The authors of the change specifically wanted to eliminate the older term replacement because people were using it to describe different procedures. That may sound like vocabulary housekeeping, but in trauma care, ambiguous language creates ambiguous actions. Take the tourniquet off could mean it was never needed. It is being moved. The wound has been packed and controlled by another method. Or someone is simply releasing it without a plan. Those are radically different situations hidden inside the same sentence. The new framework also establishes boundaries based on both time and training. Current May 2026 TCCC guidance says all previously applied tourniquets should be reassessed. When the casualty is not in shock, the wound can be watched closely, and the tourniquet is not controlling an amputation, every effort should be made to convert it within 2 hours when another method can reliably control the bleeding. The same guidance tells all service member and combat lifesaver personnel not to attempt conversion beyond 2 hours unless directed by a medic, paramedic, or other advanced medical personnel. Beyond 6 hours, removal generally requires close monitoring and laboratory capability because the risks of ischemia and reperfusion have become substantially more complicated. And I want to emphasize what those time points are not. They are not an alarm clock. A tourniquet does not become harmless at 1 hour and 59 minutes and then suddenly destroy the limb at 2 hours. The 2 hour point is a practical boundary for reassessment and provider capability. The casualty's condition, the injury, the environment, and available monitoring and access to medical care still matter. This is not medicine governed by a kitchen timer. This is risk management. The battlefield that made the old rule work. The phrase golden hour gets thrown around so often that it can start sounding like a law of nature. It's not. It describes an operational goal. Move a severely injured casualty to the care that they need as quickly as possible. During the global war on terrorism, the United States built an extraordinary trauma system around that goal. The system was not perfect, and not every casualty was evacuated in 60 minutes, but the expectation of relatively rapid movement shaped training. A tourniquet could be treated as a temporary bridge because the bridge was expected to connect to something. Combat medic, a vehicle, a helicopter, a surgical team. That expectation influences what skills need to be taught at each level. The ordinary troop does not need to manage every later complication when medical personnel and evacuation are reasonably close behind. But that model assumes the United States can move casualties. It assumes that aircrafts can fly. It assumes that vehicles can approach the point of injury. It assumes the enemy cannot continuously observe evacuation routes. It assumes that the casualty collection point will remain usable. It assumes that the next medic is reachable. Those are operational assumptions, but they're not medical facts. And Ukraine has been systematically dismantling. Ukraine changed the timeline. The Russo-Ukrainian War has created evacuation conditions radically different from the ones many American service members experienced in Iraq and Afghanistan. Persistent drone surveillance can make movement visible almost immediately. Artillery can target evacuation routes and known casualty collection points. Contested airspace can make helicopter evacuation impossible. Vehicles may be unable to approach the front without being detected and attacked. A casualty may need to be moved in small stages under concealment during limited windows across damaged terrain. The Joint Trauma System reports that evacuation in Ukraine can take 12 to 24 hours. That's huge. During that time, tourniquets may remain in place for longer than they commonly did during recent American wars. Ukrainian experience has included compartment syndrome, limb loss, electrolyte abnormalities, Ukrainian experience has included compartment syndrome, limb loss, electrolyte abnormalities, acute kidney injury, and other complications associated with prolonged tourniquet application. There are important limitations to the evidence, though. Not every amputation involving a tourniquet was caused by the tourniquet. Combat wounds severe enough to require tourniquet application may already involve destroyed blood vessels, extensive blast damage, crushed tissue, infection, or a limb that was not salvageable from the moment of the injury. Battlefield data is incomplete. Causation is also difficult to establish, and we should be deeply suspicious of anybody trying to reduce complicated combat casualties to the tourniquet was on for this many hours, therefore the tourniquet caused the amputation. The evidence does not support that kind of certainty, but it does support serious concerns. If a necessary tourniquet remains completely occlusive for 12 hours because nobody reassessed it, that is a different problem. And if a wound could have been safely converted to another method of hemorrhage control early in the evacuation, but nobody present had that knowledge or authority to attempt it, that is another problem yet again. Ukraine did not discover that tourniquets interrupt blood flow. Ukraine demonstrated what happens when a temporary intervention meets a casualty evacuation timeline that's measured in half days. The other problem, not every bleed needs a tourniquet. There is another part of this discussion that may be even more uncomfortable for the tactical community. We became very good at teaching people to use tourniquets. That was necessary. Tourniquets had spent decades burdened by old warnings that they were dangerous, that they would inevitably cost limbs, or that they should be used only as an absolute last resort. Combat experience has helped correct that. Early tourniquet application became one of the major success stories of modern battlefield medicine. Stop the Bleed helped bring that lesson into the civilian life. Tourniquets became common in police kits, range bags, vehicles, schools, workplaces, and public access bleeding control stations. That is overwhelmingly a good thing, but successful messages can create secondary problems. When people are repeatedly told that tourniquets save lives, and when applying one is simpler, faster, and easier to demonstrate than properly evaluating a wound, some people begin using them for bleeding that never required complete arterial occlusion. The Joint Trauma System now specifically points to tourniquet overuse in both civilian and Ukrainian settings, and it argues that responders need better training to distinguish life-threatening extremity hemorrhage from minor or controllable bleeding. Again, that doesn't mean that someone under fire should spend 5 minutes conducting a delicate vascular assessment while a casualty is bleeding heavily. Care under fire is still care under fire. You solve the immediate lethal problem and move the casualty. But once the tactical situation changes, the medical decision should also change. What was reasonable during the first 30 seconds may deserve reassessment during the next 30 minutes. That's why TCCC has phases. Tactics and medicine remain connected. Two risks, not one. The simplest way to understand the doctrinal change is that the military is trying to manage two different risks. The first risk is obvious. An inexperienced person loosens a necessary tourniquet. Bleeding resumes. The casualty dies. The second risk becomes more important as evacuation time grows. A tourniquet that was unnecessary or could have been converted remains fully occlusive for many hours. The old baseline rule heavily protected against the first error. That made sense when a medic and evacuation were expected relatively soon. A battlefield with 12-hour delays increases the cost of the second error. The military is not deciding that limb preservation suddenly matters more than survival. It is recognizing that never touch it may not be enough guidance for the person who is still holding the casualty 6 hours later. That person may not have a medic standing beside them. They may be the only responder available. So the capability has to move downward, not because the procedure became simple, but because the support system has become less reliable. A medic's decision without a medic. I think this is the part of the story that matters beyond tactical medicine. Militaries distribute responsibilities based on what they expect the organization to provide. You do not train every infantryman to perform every medical procedure because specialization is efficient. The medic carries more equipment. The medic receives more education. The medic understands complications. The medic can monitor the patient. And ideally, the medic arrives before these complications become the infantryman's problem. But prolonged casualty care forces organizations to reconsider where expertise has to live. If the medic cannot reach the casualty cannot reach the medic, and evacuation cannot move, the person at the point of injury inherits responsibilities that the old system assigned to someone else. That's what makes this change significant. It's not really about giving ordinary troops permission to remove a piece of nylon. It is, however, about acknowledging that they may need to manage a casualty far longer than their traditional training assumed. Once you accept that, tourniquet conversion is probably not the last medical skill that has to move down the chain. Casualty monitoring becomes more important, as well as shock recognition, documentation, hypothermia prevention, and repeated reassessment. The individual first aid kit starts looking less like a collection of immediate interventions and more like the first layer of a prolonged care system. That does not mean that every rifleman becomes a paramedic. It means the line between first aid and continued care shifts when nobody is coming to relieve the first responder. What this does not mean for civilians. At this point, somebody is going to ask, what does this mean for the tourniquet in my range bag? For most people, it doesn't mean that you should teach yourself tourniquet conversion from YouTube. God, please don't do that. The military is discussing this change inside a structured training system. Even the proposed expansion involves training personnel to recognize shock, assess bleeding, understand contraindications, monitor the wound, and respond if hemorrhaging returns. It is not wait 2 hours, then loosen the windlass. The civilian application is more fundamental. Owning an intervention is not the same as understanding the system around it. You can buy a tourniquet, you can learn how to apply it, you can carry one every day, but the tourniquet cannot tell you whether the bleeding actually requires it, how long emergency medical services are going to take, whether the wound can be controlled another way, whether the casualty is entering shock, whether the wound can be continuously observed. It doesn't tell you what to do if the bleeding returns, or what complications may develop during a prolonged evacuation. That does not make carrying the tourniquet pointless. It means the equipment represents one decision inside of a longer chain of care. For most civilian emergencies in the United States, calling 911 and leaving a correctly applied tourniquet in place for professional reassessment remains the sensible expectation. We are not operating under Russian drone coverage, but there are civilian environments where evacuation can be delayed. Whether you're remote hunting, backcountry travel, the major natural disasters, severe weather, mass casualty incidents that overwhelm local resources. Those possibilities should encourage people to pursue deeper training and think about communication and evacuation. They should not encourage improvisation beyond their competence. There is a strange habit in the preparedness world where learning that an advanced option exists is immediately treated as permission to perform it. It's not. Sometimes the intelligent lesson is simply recognizing that the subject is more complicated than the slogan. The gear was never the whole system. This also changes how I personally think about an IFAC. Most conversations about medical kits begin and end with the contents. Which tourniquet, how much gauze, chest seals or no chest seals, which pouch. Those are legitimate questions. They've been answered in a previous video of mine. But a medical kit is built around assumptions. What injuries are expected? What training does the user have? How many casualties might there be? Who takes over care? How long will the evacuation take? How will the casualty be moved? How will the interventions be monitored? The same CAT tourniquet can exist in two completely different systems. In one system, it controls bleeding for 40 minutes before a trauma surgeon takes over. In another system, it is still controlling the limb 12 hours later while the casualty waits in a basement because every vehicle approaching the position is being watched. The object is identical in the two systems, but the problem is not. And that is one of the most important lessons in preparedness. Generally, equipment does not carry its own context. We simply supply the context through planning, training, and the system built around it. Was the old rule wrong? No. I do not think put it on and leave it alone was a bad doctrine. I think it was good instruction designed for a specific audience and a specific risk. It helped reverse dangerous hesitation around tourniquet use, and it saved lots of lives. It prevented untrained people from restarting catastrophic hemorrhage. It supported a casualty evacuation system that was usually expected to move patients rapidly towards higher care. The problem is not that the old rule was foolish. The problem would be pretending that a rule designed around those conditions must remain unchanged after the conditions disappear. Doctrine is not scripture. It is an organized answer to an expected problem. When the problem changes, refusing to reconsider the answer is not consistency. It is institutional inertia. In this case, the institution is reconsidering it. Current TCCC guidelines preserve immediate tourniquet application for life-threatening extremity bleeding. It preserves contraindications against conversion in shock when the wound cannot be monitored or when the tourniquet controls an amputation. It preserves more restrictive boundaries as application time increases. What it adds is a more explicit expectation that tourniquets will be reassessed, and that trained non-medical personnel may need to act during the first 2 hours rather than waiting indefinitely for a medic who may be unable to reach them. That is not a repudiation of the tourniquet revolution. It is the next stage of it. First, the military had to convince people to apply tourniquets early enough to save lives. Now it has to teach them that stopping the bleeding is the beginning of casualty management, not the end of it. Conclusion. So, yes, the military is teaching more troops that a tourniquet may eventually need to come off. But that sentence leaves out almost everything important. Combat medics already knew that. Combat lifesavers already received more advanced hemorrhage control training. The physiologically did not suddenly change. The tourniquet did not suddenly become less effective. What changed was the expectation that somebody else would arrive quickly enough to make the next decision. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan helped build the modern tourniquet doctrine most of us recognize. Ukraine is now testing the evacuation assumptions beneath it. And the lesson appears to be that the next war may not provide a golden hour. It may not provide a helicopter. It may not even be able to provide a medic. So the soldier who stopped the bleeding may still be managing that casualty hours later. And if that is the battlefield the military expects, then teaching people only how to apply a tourniquet is no longer enough. They also have to understand that every life-saving intervention creates a patient who still needs to be managed. Tourniquets did not change that, but the battlefield did. If you stayed this long, I really appreciate you, and thank you so much for sitting here and listening to me ramble for however long this video is going to end up being after I cut down the hours of me rambling. If you did like it and you find any of this useful, please like, comment, subscribe. I really like to hear what your thoughts about these new tourniquet changes are. Please share this to somebody that you think might be able to benefit from watching this video. And the giveaway for this exact IFAC is still going live. Once we reach 100 subs, I will give one of these away to the people who leave relevant comments down below. Thank you so much and have a great day.